Civil society organizations are unhappy that National Treasury seems determined to unilaterally push through what they describe as a misguided and unfeasible proposal for income support. Groups have been pushing government to extend its COVID-19 social relief of distress grant past April 2022 to a basic income grant for those aged 18 to 59. For more on the story, we're joined by the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute founding director, Isabel Fry. Isabel, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. So, these proposals that, and I say these because there seems to be a lot of uncertainty about what exactly it is that's on Treasury's table right now that is up for consideration. But talk to me about what it is specifically that you have heard that the National Treasury is considering in terms of shaking up the grant system in the country.
Thanks very much, Kathy, and good evening to your viewers. As you say, the problem is that what we have heard seems to be shrouded in obscurity. We are very cognizant of the fact that to determine the budget is the prerogative of the Minister of Finance, but this is an obligation that needs to be done in terms of the Constitution, and the Constitution is very clear about the need of government or for government to consult very widely with people and to allow the public to participate in the policy making. Now, as we're all aware in South Africa, firstly, we have an incredibly huge problem around poverty and hunger, as you mentioned in the headlining. 1 in 4 people in South Africa before COVID was living beneath the starvation line. 1 in 2 people are living below the poverty line. Now, we also know from a number of the statistical analyses that have happened since COVID, as well as just from people we know and looking around as ordinary people, that poverty levels have risen dramatically. We know that that's linked to the fact that unemployment has increased as a result of firms shutting down and a lack of demand. Now, into that gap, the President announced the introduction of the 350 Rand special COVID grant. Now, that's actually not just out of nowhere, that's a constitutional obligation that the state has to enable people who are not able to support themselves to have some access to income. So I think we need to just to think of it in that sense. There is a huge need. There is a constitutional obligation. And the state took administrative action by announcing the introduction of the 350 Rand and listening to people. Instead of extending it for 3 months at a time, which left the poor in a state of deep dependency and vulnerability about what would happen after the end of that current 3-month period, the state took a very bold step and extended that to the end of March 2022, which many people praised the state for doing. Now, many of us believe that that would be the foundation of the introduction of a basic income grant because it's a huge need. And we've got 22 million adults who are not in employment and who have needs, who have hopes, dreams, and dependents. What we've heard that instead of introducing a permanent social relief of distress grant or an unemployment grant, as some people call it, because it would be targeted at unemployed adults between the ages of 18 and 59, National Treasury has been looking and sort of commissioned some research into the costs and the shape of something called a household grant. The trouble is that it's impossible to engage rationally because we don't know the size or the shape of it. We've heard that it might be targeted at the household head, that instead of the 8 million people who are currently getting social relief of distress, which even of itself is far short of the 22 million people who are unemployed, it would be reduced to 1 million. And the reason this is so problematic, Kathy, is not just the humanitarian failure, it's not just the constitutional failure, but right now, when our economy is on its knees and certainly not capable of growing at the rates that economists are saying we need for recovery, the stimulus of the social relief of distress grants that goes into communities and that builds up from the grassroots up a groundswell demand is going to be decimated. And it seems as if the people who have the ability to make the decisions are firstly not prepared to engage, I would say courageously, in an open debate, on insisting on using the prerogative of putting this to cabinet, which we hear is going to be on the 9th of November, which will then go into the postponed MTBPS, the medium-term budget policy statement. I believe that we've talked about constitutional crises in the past. I believe that this is an ethical crisis, a crisis of the morality of our country. And on the eve of the local government elections, where we're all being asked to put our hope and faith into people to represent us, we've got to ask what's happening to the representative democracy at the national level.
There are a couple of issues that become problematic when it comes to this model, Isabel, specifically for South Africa, because we know that how households are constructed is a very complicated matter in this country. And the research or the model that National Treasury seems to be working from is what has taken place in Brazil, and how, you know, this family grant, as it is, has been implemented there. Do you think that it's fundamentally a solution that can work for South Africa right now?
As you say, it seems as if the Bolsa Familia that was introduced under President Lula in Brazil is the model. The problem is when you take things out of context, and Bolsa Familia was just one initiative of a slew of reforms that happened and that enabled the Lula government to uplift people out of poverty. So one on its own is certainly not going to do that. As you mentioned, the household dynamics in South Africa, which is a country that is still transforming from a deeply patriarchal structure in which there's also a high level of gender-based violence, means that if payments go to the head of a household, there has to be a negotiation of access to that money. And from the research that's been undertaken in the social policy field in South Africa from the Land Committee in the late 1990s, demonstrates that people without power, which generally is the woman in the household, struggle to access that money. So it does not seem as if this is a reform. Rather, it seems that this is a regression of the empowerment that women in South Africa so desperately need. It's a withdrawal of the individual right of access to social security, which we've so long been arguing for. And it seems to be taking a very blunt policy instrument and applying it to completely the wrong set of criteria for a solution. We've all been saying, let's look at a solution that's actually used the COVID moment, the crisis that we find ourselves in, to leapfrog to a better starting point. And it seems that we're just being taken back. Because if we look at the unemployment figures, and if we speak to people who are able to model those going forward, we're not going to have the kind of job recovery. As we see wages being dampened, the whole level of the social wage needs to be increasing. But if we're continually cutting the inputs into poor communities, there is very little left of that social fabric. Now, it was only in July that we saw our communities disintegrate into a kind of violent protest, which was more than just what it was cited for. It goes to the fact, as I said, that at the moral fabric of our society, it seems that the poor don't matter.
Isabel, we're going to have to leave it there for tonight. She's with the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. When news at